I actually answered the phone, was going to take the order, and the guy literally was saying GD every other word. And he kept doing it, and I thought, I need to say something. And so I did. I was like, no, look, appreciate your order, but the God that you're using that phrase with, we actually believe he's real and we worship him.
Jase, this was interesting. I told you I spoke in Madison, Georgia at an event. And so they sent me to run a show just to make sure I was okay with it, kind of what was going to happen that night. And they had 2 video clips of Dad from the internet in the worship segment. And the first one was just him doing a little bit we did one time when he did one of his books about him sharing the gospel, sitting on his front steps. It's excellent. So good. And then the second one was him telling the story in the duck blind about the guy who called him up and said GD on the phone.
Yeah.
And he said, why would you curse the one who created you? And the guy calls back and says, you know, that got me thinking. And so he winds up coming over, Dad baptized. So they showed those 2 clips before I spoke. And when they asked me if it was okay for them to do that, it just was such a moment. Because, you know, for like all the early years when we were doing the show, and Dad was going around and speaking, he wanted me to be a part of it. And so just out of kindness to me, because I'd started working for Duck Commander again, and y'all were doing the show. At first, I wasn't on the show. And he would have me introduce him at all these venues. And so I would do a little 5-minute, like, funny stuff up front and then bring Dad out. And so I got to introduce him, and that kind of is what got me going in the speaking world. And I told the guys in Georgia, I said, well, you know, it's full circle because I introduced for Dad for all those years. And I guess now for the first time, he's introducing for me because it was some of his old clips. And so it was just another reminder that we are so blessed because of all the video and videography that's been out there that we get to still listen to our dad. And you do too, the audience, because there's so much that's been done of him getting to speak. And so, you know, you just don't get that. I mean, the picture of, I told this before, but the picture of Judge Robertson, who was Dad's great-grandfather, there's one picture of him and one story. He got shot on a levee by a federal agent. My granny told me that. That's all I know about this man. He was a judge. But with our dad, you know, and my kid's great-grandfather, they get to hear him, what he knows about the gospel, how he feels about relationships, what he thinks about the Bible. So we are pretty blessed when you think about it.
Well, even that story you told, Phil told that story so many times, it got a little changed, but I actually answered the phone, was going to take the order, and the guy literally was saying GD every other word. Like, not in a mad, he was just, it was just part of his language. You know, I take the order, and he kept doing it, and I thought, I need to say something. And so I did. I was like, no, look, appreciate your order, but the God that you're using that phrase with, we actually believe he's real and we worship him. So I confronted him at the end of the conversation, and he just didn't say anything, just got quiet. He's like, all right. So I hang up, and then I go back out to the shop or whatever. Well, then he called back. Well, Phil answered the phone, which was unusual, but he did every once in a while. And so the guy's like looking for me, and he's like, no, he's working. He's like, well, and then that guy tells my dad what just happened. Oh, wow. But it convicted me because I thought, you know, here's my dad. He took it to another level because the guy was apologizing. He was having a good attitude. He's like, I just have said that so much. I really wasn't thinking about it. And then that's when our dad said, hey, here's what you need. Where are you from? He was from Alabama. He said, you need to get in your truck and get over here, and we'll tell you about him. And so the next day, he did and brought a buddy. And that's how that story happened. My dad shared Jesus with him, and it was during a flood.
Yeah, backwater.
The backwater. So it wasn't no walk to the river. We literally walked in the yard. He got in the ditch of our road, and he baptized both of them. And then he was like, I'll give you a change of clothes. And they're like, no, we're driving back to Alabama, soaking wet. And it was so incredible. Yeah, that's how the story happened.
So he tells that on the video. He didn't tell the part about you, but that makes it even better. But and then I told them the Paul Harvey rest of the story, because years later, and this was after Dad did the video, obviously, but Dad is at an event, and I was there too, in Alabama speaking, and this guy, the same guy, comes up, and I didn't know him. I guess I wasn't there the day all this happened with y'all baptizing him, but he comes up and he says, "You remember me, Mr. Phil?" And he said, "Well, I don't think so." And he said, "Well, you baptized me in the backwater. I was the one that used the Lord's name in vain." And he was like, "Oh, yeah." And so, look, the guy was a deacon at this church and had gotten Dad to speak there. Had actually lined it up for him. I mean, and I saw the audience loved it, from Georgia.
That's pretty well how Jesus rolled. In other words, you have to be ready at the moment. Whatever moment there is, the guy that called me and said, and used God's name in vain about 5 times, ordering a duck call. And I was thinking, man, I said, look, why you keep cursing the only one that can save you from death? Well, there was just silence. About the 5th time, he said, GD, something. I thought, why do you keep cursing him? Well, there was silence on the phone. He said, hey, you got my order? I said, I got your order. So he hangs up. 10 minutes goes by. The phone rings again. He said, hey. I said, yep. He said, it's me again. He said, I've never thought about that. I said, well, you curse God like he's done something to you. I said, man, he can save you, give you eternal life. I said, you know what you ought to do? And I looked down at his sheet right quick. I said, you ought to drive over here. I said, it's about, from where you are, about 8, 9 hours. I said, you ought to drive over here, and I'll tell you a story about the one you're cursing. I said, you may change your mind. He said, well, I might do that, Hoss. I said, you ought to. Boom. A week goes by, and the knock on the door, and the dude steps in. He said, you know who I am? I said, he's a husky. I said, no, I don't believe I ever met you. He said, I'm the one that was cursing God. I said, so you did come? He said, I got to know. I said, come on in here. Look, he was converted. 17 years went by. I'm speaking over there in the state he was from. And the preacher says, somebody walked up there and he said, Phil, you remember the dude that was cursing God on the phone? I said, cursing God on the phone? I said, I remember that way back. I said, that's been a long time ago, 15, 20 years ago. He said, he's down there waiting on you, wanting to talk to you. He heard you was coming to this church tonight. He said, by the way, he's one of the leaders of this church now. Mm-hmm. I said, my point is, just like you and that girl, you never know.
Well, I mean,
you never know how God works in your life. But
do we believe God, is working, living, and active?
Doing that is hard to do in a church building, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, I don't know where we got into this.
Paul said making the most of every opportunity because the time is short. I mean, you think about it, you only get so many opportunities like that in the course of your whole life. Right. It goes by fast.
I didn't have
there's
to
a lot
say
more
anything.
than that guy, but that was just one that kind of stood out of my mind when we were discussing
this question.